So the new U.S. Army uniforms that came out in the 1870s were largely based on German uniform patterns. So the fatigue blouse is largely an American design. This is called a mounted services jacket, and then this is a dress coat or frock coat. And there were other countries that uniforms were inspired from as well. So the Hardy hat, which is the hat on the end, that was inspired by a Danish military uniform hat. So those are some of the Taylor's Falls soldiers, and I had photographs there of some photographs I can find of local soldiers. To talk about what happened to some of the Minnesota soldiers before we move on to Wisconsin soldiers. So George Burt of the 1st Minnesota Infantry was wounded in action at the Battle of First Bull Run, and but he continued in his service, and then he died in early 1864 at Fort Snelling. And he actually jumped off of the cliff just east of Fort Snelling after having a lot of alcohol. And John Longquist from Taylor's Falls, he re-enlisted in the 1st Minnesota Battalion, which was the succeeding unit to the 1st Minnesota Infantry, and he was killed in action at Petersburg, Virginia, June 22nd, 1864. Wade Lufkin of Taylor's Falls was promoted to corporal and sergeant, and he was killed in action during the Battle of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania on July 3rd, 1863, and he is buried at Gettysburg National Cemetery. Then in the 7th Minnesota Infantry that Wyman Folsom was a member of, another member of that regiment from Taylor's Falls was Lucius Smith, and he was a doctor from here, and he was the assistant surgeon and surgeon of the regiment, and he was killed in action just before the Battle of Tupelo, Mississippi, when the regiment, while on the march, was ambushed by some of Nathan Bedford Forrest's Confederate cavalry. And in 1866, after the war ended, his body was brought back to Taylor's Falls and buried in the cemetery here. In the 7th Minnesota Infantry, Company C, several of the soldiers who didn't make it home were Joseph Clendening. He died of disease in Memphis, Tennessee, December 20th, 1864. He's buried at Mississippi River National Cemetery. Andrew Colby, a first sergeant, he was mortally wounded at the Battle of Tupelo, Mississippi on July 14th and died shortly thereafter. There were other local men in units such as the 1st Minnesota and 2nd Minnesota Light Artillery Batteries and the 1st Minnesota Heavy Artillery Regiment. Even a Taylor's Falls resident who traveled to Iowa to join the 8th Iowa Cavalry, but then deserted while the regiment was on its way east. And then also in 1861, several Taylor's Falls men crossed the river into St. Croix Falls to join a company that was being recruited there. That company was called the St. Croix Rifles, and they were being recruited by a London-born Jewish trader who lived in St. Croix Falls named Maurice Samuel. And that company actually drilled on the northern edge of Taylor's St. Croix Falls. And then after they were sent south, several of their major battles were the battles of Perryville, Kentucky, Stones River, Tennessee, and Chickamauga, Georgia. And of the Taylor's Falls men in that unit, James Gilroy of Taylor's Falls was wounded at Chickamauga. William Hutchinson of Taylor's Falls was also wounded at Chickamauga. And Duncan McKenzie of Taylor's Falls was captured at Chickamauga and then sent to Andersonville Prison in Georgia, where he died July 7th, 1864, and is now buried at Andersonville National Cemetery. A couple other Taylor's Falls soldiers, Henry and Seymour Colby, joined Company B of the 6th Wisconsin Infantry, which was a company being recruited down in Prescott, Wisconsin. And that regiment, the 6th Wisconsin, was part of what became the Iron Brigade, which was the 2nd, 6th, and 7th Wisconsin Infantry, the 19th Indiana Infantry, the 24th Michigan Infantry, as well as Battery B of the 4th U.S. Artillery. And so the hat on the end actually has the insignia, including the red circle corps badge for the Iron Brigade. Both of them were transferred from the 6th Wisconsin into the artillery battery attached to the brigade, Battery B of the 4th U.S. Artillery. Henry was wounded at the Battle of Antietam, Maryland, September 17th, 1862, which was the bloodiest day in American history. Over 23,000 Americans killed, wounded, and missing. And then Seymour Colby later joined Company A of the 42nd Wisconsin Infantry. And another soldier from here, Joseph Allen, became a corporal, sergeant, and then lieutenant in the 1st Minnesota Light Artillery Battery. That battery fought throughout the Western Theater in battles like Shiloh. Allen was wounded at Corinth, Mississippi in October 1862, and he then died of disease on a hospital boat on March 2nd, 1863, and he was buried in Louisiana, then returned home to Ohio. Another town I wanted to talk a little bit about was Franconia and a few of their soldiers, including Johannes Lindahl. He was a Swedish-born officer in the 3rd Minnesota Infantry. And maybe on average, I guess. Obviously, some of them served in. Yes, by far, most of them served in the Western Theater. So the 1st Minnesota is the largest outlier, with serving with the Army of the Potomac, which was the principal Union Army in the Eastern Theater. And the Eastern Theater mostly consists of Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania, as well as you could consider the Carolinas as well. So this is Jonas Lindahl. So this is the Americanized version of his name. His Swedish name was Johannes Lindahl with a H, and he was from Franconia. And actually on his uniform, you can see the badge he's wearing. That is another Corps badge. So the badge he's wearing is for the 7th Corps, which adopted their badge in 1865, and they were in Arkansas. So he and his regiment were in Arkansas near the end of his service. And afterwards, if you want to come up, I do have quite a few examples of cloth Corps badges, which were largely adopted starting in 1863, so midway through the conflict. And those were essentially the first unit identification badges that are still seen in the military today. and from Scandia and Franconia and areas in Chicago County with a lot of Polish people. Many of them joined units, and so Company D of the 3rd Minnesota that Lindahl was a member of actually had 70 Swedes and 30 Norwegians. So out of about 100-man company, they were almost all Scandinavians.
They fought each other.
The 15th Wisconsin Infantry was an entire regiment that consisted of Scandinavians, and actually a story about that regiment. So they were called the Scandinavian Regiment, and it said that they had 128 members with the name Ol, 75 Olsons, and 15 Olsons. So that became a little bit of a problem. So after talking about some of the Minnesotans along the St. Croix River who served in the Civil War, I'll talk about some people from the Wisconsin side of the river. And most of this presentation is about people from Chisago County, Minnesota, and Polk County, Wisconsin. I thought about going into Stillwater and Hudson and Prescott, though those towns actually had much larger populations than the towns in this area during the Civil War. So Polk County and Chisago County towns, most of them were only a couple hundred people, whereas down St. Croix and Washington counties, those areas, Pierce County, a lot of the towns there, like Stillwater and Hudson, had 1,000 or 2,000 people. So there would be a lot more research and a lot more presentation that could be done on those areas of the St. Croix River. And also, during the 1860s, because of the dalles of the St. Croix River and the rapids here, as many of you probably know, this was the head of navigation of the river for steamboats. So Taylor's Falls and St. Croix Falls were the furthest north large established towns at that time, and most of what was north of here were still lumber camps and wilderness. So here we have Robert Creighton Murphy, who was a resident of St. Croix Falls in 1861. He actually came here to manage the Cushing Land Company. A lot of you probably know the town of Cushing across the river. And so that was named after an Eastern investor named Caleb Cushing. And Cushing and Murphy had served as diplomats together actually in China, is where they met. And so Cushing offered Murphy the opportunity to manage his land company in St. Croix Falls. But then, Murphy had served in the Mexican-American War in the 1840s as well. Then when the American Civil War began in 1861, because of his prior military experience, the governor of Wisconsin, Alexander Randall, appointed Murphy to command the 8th Wisconsin Infantry. And that is one of the fairly well-known Wisconsin regiments, primarily because of their pet bald eagle, nicknamed Old Abe. So the 8th Wisconsin was called the Eagle Regiment. Old Abe, the eagle, was brought to the regiment by Company C of the 8th Wisconsin, which was from the Eau Claire area. And the eagle was actually put on a wooden perch and carried into the regiment's campaigns and battles from 1861 all the way until 1864. So, unfortunately for Robert Murphy, he encountered some difficulties in his Civil War career. So, in late 1862, he was put in charge of one and then another Union supply depot in Mississippi, first at Iuka and then at Holly Springs, Mississippi. And both of those supply depots ended up being raided by Confederate cavalry. And the Holly Springs depot was actually the base of operations for General Ulysses S. Grant's first operation to capture Vicksburg, Mississippi. And so with the Confederates destroying the Union supplies, Grant was forced to abandon his first campaign for Vicksburg. And Grant essentially blamed Colonel Murphy, who was in charge of the depot, for letting it fall into Confederate hands. So he was dismissed from the service in early 1863 and did not hold another military command again. So here is Malachi Coe on the right. So he was a musician. So musicians during the Civil War were often drummers or buglers. They could be fifers as well. And he was part of Company F of the 1st Wisconsin Infantry, which was that company recruited mostly from St. Croix Falls and Taylor's Falls. And actually, in Company F of the 1st Wisconsin, in their first major battle that they fought in at Perryville, Kentucky on October 8th, 1862, a 19-year-old member of their regiment, Private John Durham, saw Henry Kaler, who was a local resident who was carrying the regimental colors. Durham saw him killed and the flag fall, and so Private Durham picked it up and carried it forward between the Union and Confederate lines, and by some accounts also captured a Confederate battle flag in the process. And so he actually was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor after being a soldier who was recruited right here in St. Croix Falls. This is William Foster, a post-war photograph. He was one of the first, his family was one of the first two who settled in Luck, Wisconsin. Then he also enlisted in Osceola, which at that time was called Osceola Mills. And the town that we now know as Marine on St. Croix during the Civil War was actually called Marine Mills. And that's primarily because of the lumber mills, because you remember that the St. Croix River was a large channel and for the lumber industry to float logs down the rivers. So the 4th Wisconsin was originally an infantry regiment, then they were converted to a cavalry regiment midway through the war, and they first served in Maryland and then were transported by ship to New Orleans and served in the Western Theater throughout the rest of the war. And William Foster was one of the longest serving soldiers on this list, remaining in the Army from 1861 all the way till 1866. Since regiments like the 2nd and 4th Wisconsin Cavalry, which had quite a few Polk County men in them, after the war were actually sent to the Mexican border in Texas, because the French, led by Emperor Maximilian, had actually invaded Mexico, and so a large force of U.S. Army troops was sent to Texas to enforce the Monroe Doctrine of basically not having European powers interfere in the Americas. And so this is another member of that unit, Byron Smith Kenyon, who was from Osceola, and he was in Company G, and then he was a member of a special unit called the Earl Scouts. So that unit was essentially just a couple dozen soldiers who were selected to serve as scouts and you might call them spies as well throughout the South, and just gathering intelligence for Union operations. And Byron, unfortunately, the year that the war ended, he decided to remain in the South, but he became ill and died in 1865. So he contracted yellow fever in New Orleans. Another local soldier, Daniel Mears, he recruited quite a few men from the Osceola area to join Company D of the 2nd Wisconsin Cavalry. And that unit's, one of their largest battles was Prairie Grove, Arkansas, which was fought December 7th, 1862. And then, like the 4th Wisconsin Cavalry, they also served in Texas in 1865. And actually, while they were serving in Texas, they were placed under the command of a young general named George Armstrong Custer. And Custer was a West Point graduate, class of 1861. Actually, the ring that I'm wearing is a exact replica of the West Point class of 1861 class ring. So this is the ring that Custer would have had. But he, after the Civil War ended, was commanding troops in Texas, and he wanted to discipline the men, and so essentially there was several officers who he would say that they mutinied, and also a deserter from the regiment. And so Custer ordered that all of those officers recant their statements, and all of them did but one. And so that officer and a deserter from the 2nd Wisconsin Cavalry, General Custer ordered them to be executed by firing squad. And the unfortunate task of commanding that firing squad fell to Sergeant George Clark of Osceola. And just seconds before he had to give the command, the officer was pulled out from in front of the guns, and he was sentenced to hard labor. But the deserter was left in front of George Clark's firing squad.